Nailed
That
it.
is so cool. Yeah, it works. It works. The whole technology thing. I'm ready for this whole fad to be over.
You need a, the whole.
We're good.
Calling this meeting to order. Today is Wednesday, September 8th, and this is the Rules and Policy Committee. First item is roll call. I see both counselors are accounted for. Next item is approval of the minutes. Is there any discussion for the minutes? Can I get a motion?
So
Second.
All in favor, raise your hand. All right. Unanimous. Next item up for discussion is the valuation policy. So just to set the stage here, at our finance committee meeting 2 weeks ago, when we were learning about TIFs, we talked about the need to potentially revisit some of our policies, and the valuation policy was the first one that I think we identified as something we would discuss in rules and policy. So just opening it up for general discussion. I'll just kind of kick things off. I looked at it, it's very short. And so I think I have more questions than feedback at this point. I'm hoping, Nick, you can kind of share some of your insights and thoughts as well, just to kind of give us your perspective, because I think the policy was in place before you were here.
It's true. Yeah.
So just understanding where we are today, if there are any changes we want to make, any questions we have that we want to kind of work through, maybe get a different, some other options from you in terms of what we do differently would be helpful. So I don't know, John or Paul, if you guys have anything specific you want to add at this point, or
no, I'll try and remember.
okay.
Yep. And I think the last sentence said this policy should be looked at again once there's a revaluation through townwide revaluation. So
Okay, so maybe just, Nick, not to put you on the spot,
no, it's okay.
but maybe just from your perspective, can you talk a little bit about the valuation process as part of budget, like what you do today, how you get your estimate, just to kind of.
Sure. And I can also speak to this policy here too. So I'll gloss over and then you can ask specific questions, but the past 2 years, I've provided an estimate as best I could based on what I knew in the pipeline of permits and kind of estimating what those might be as of April 1st, a few months ahead of time. And it's not an exact process, but it was the only option because this process, and I'll explain why, no longer worked correctly right after the revaluation. It skewed the data. So I glossed over how I arrived at valuation estimates the past 2 years, but why this previous policy doesn't seem to work or wouldn't have in previous years. And it said in it, after a revaluation, it might not work. What in effect this policy was doing is taking the last 10 years of year-over-year increase in taxable value and kind of smoothing out a trend over those years. Because some years it'd be, 1%, some years it'd be 2%. Most years it was around 1 or so, and I can give you examples or less even. But then in the reval years, it was 6% and 17%. So then, whatever it would have been, an average of 1% or 1.5 skewed all the way to 3% overnight. And that's a really good year. In fact, we haven't had a 3% year other than the reval year. So it would have projected in 2 years ago when the valuation increase was only 30 million because of extenuating factors, abatements, and the homestead going up. It would have projected it at 130 something million. And then last year, this year moving forward, I'll speak about that. It would create a rate of 2.9%. So that's, last year was a very big year and it was only 2.5. So it's still overestimating because of those 2 revaluation years, what the trend line is. It's no longer an accurate reporting because of those 2 years throwing everything off in the positive direction. So I believe we're all here today to discuss an alternative method until something like this may work again, or just something instead of this because it may no longer work due to the revaluation. And I have some suggestions. One would be to keep it as simple as possible. So, I'm aware of Councilor Clucci having good data analysis skills, but what if he wasn't here 5 or 10 years from now? You want to make it something that is doable for a future council. And you would also want it to be, I would think, able to speak to the anomalies in years where things such as revaluations or large abatements or changes in state level exemption programs skew the data, and what you would do in those instances, or at least leave a window open so it doesn't tie council to using a method that wouldn't work that year. And then I think we're also here to discuss, not to get ahead of it, if there's anything you want to do, if your estimates come above or below, and that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, if I could just chime in. So I think Nick did a nice job. I think the two things that we want to talk about is how we arrive, how the council arrives from a budget planning process at an estimated additional valuation, right? So that's the equation. I think you're looking for some insight from the assessor as to how we've been provided that number, or how he's provided that number in that process, and whether there's, again, a policy that the council can adopt or a methodology that the council can adopt to do that more deliberately and transparently. And then I think from there, the second part of the conversation is really about, and again, this was the tail end of the conversation around the bond workshop, or TIF workshop rather. In the event there's an that value comes in higher than our estimation, what do you want to do with those additional dollars? And again, I think the thought is that you want to perhaps split that between tax rate relief and planning adequately for some other financial challenges or objectives. And so I think that, so is that adequately kind of frame where you want to go with it? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I was going to try to actually step a little bit back. So with this policy, the one that's been in place, really the target is to try to smooth your spending. So you have consistent spending increases over time. But what we usually talk about is when we do our goal setting for the council, we want to smooth our tax, the tax rate. We want to have a consistent tax rate. And this doesn't necessarily lead to a consistent tax rate, because you're going to be off, right? You're using a historical average to project the future. To get to a consistent tax rate or predictable tax rate, you really want to match your spending increase with your valuation increase to the extent you can. Now, you can't, because there's a timing gap, right? So we don't necessarily know what our valuation is going to go up when we go through the budget process. But the closer we can get to it in the year of, the less fluctuation we're going to have in the tax rate. So I guess that's the first point I think that we might want to reaffirm. Is that our goal? Or do we want to be trying to drive towards a consistent tax rate, or is it to smooth spending? There's pros and cons to both. I think the tax rate, that's how we've been framing the conversation about it for a long time. So I think that makes more sense, is to try to let's keep our tax rate as predictable and consistent as possible.
Quick question, Nick, for you. I feel like the last 2 or 3 years, I think the 3 years I've been in council, I feel like this formula has underestimated our organic growth, right? And that's not the case.
This one would have overstated.
This one would have.
That's why I was asked to do it manually with my best information I could.
Okay, so not to come out the wrong way, but we didn't follow this policy this year then. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Yeah, all right.
And last year we didn't do it.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
so this is,
Yeah.
that's fair, because I believe, and it makes sense we didn't do it last year, because that was last year?
That was 3 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But, so I think it's fair to say, and this is not me saying you're not following policy, but we haven't really been following this policy, because I feel like there's been an inherent understanding that this has some shortcomings. Is that? Yeah.
It worked for 2 or 3 years, and then the reval made it not work, and it hasn't been used since.
Okay, and so you've been almost doing a ad hoc policy probably by getting at our request, so to speak, right? We want an accurate picture of what the new valuation is. Okay, I just wanted to clear that for my own.
But I do think this has a lot more value. I think you all taking, back control of this process makes a whole lot of sense, and me being as minimally involved as possible at that stage of the game is wise.
Yeah.
So getting something in place of this that will serve this purpose again would be great.
Yeah.
Well, now that we're switching, right, because we're switching to a 3-year valuation, or what's the plan right now? in terms of
There isn't a
how often?
plan. That was just my suggestion to be, revisited as we got closer.
But I
So
think that's
more
also gonna have an
frequent, more
impact on-
frequent. But
Yeah.
even if it's every 4 to 5, if that's the, appetite for it, it will be more frequent. So you can't have a policy that doesn't account for those years. Like this one, this can't work a year after reval, maybe even 2 years after. Well, then it can't work half the years, anymore.
So why wouldn't we then just build a policy, like basically what you're doing today in terms of some of the manual work? Why wouldn't we just say that's the policy or the approach we want to take to estimate? Can you talk a little bit about like what you've done? the past couple of
One
years?
generic reason would be, I don't know the legal, stance on it, but you can't bind a future assessor to certain things that they have to do, including myself as that future assessor. So it can only be a suggestion. It couldn't be a rule I'd have to follow potentially. I'm not sure if that's actually how it works. And then furthermore, it's not a scientific process. There's not like numbers I plug in. It's a lot of me subjectively, using my best guess estimates. And that was better than a flawed math, but I don't think it's a wise choice to have something that's so subjective on me versus something that's based in data that any one of you could look at and come to the same conclusion.
So you're trying to factor in those variables to the best of your knowledge, looking at.
Yeah.
You're looking at what the field work is suggesting for a value that's coming on, and you're kind of narrowing it all down, and it's really more of an art than a science at that point for a
Yeah.
projection. I mean, it's an
Mhm.
estimation. So to quantify that in the form of a policy, I think would be exceedingly difficult.
Yeah.
And the question is there some scientific or actual data that would lend itself to a closer
Yeah.
estimate?
Yeah, in general, algorithms are fairly stupid, right? They need a driver, somebody who can interpret what they're looking
Yeah.
at. And I did have a conversation with Tom about this, and he was concerned about putting anything on the assessor
Sure.
for the same reasons you've outlined. That doesn't mean that you can't have an input to the process. And
Sure.
he suggested maybe that's phrased through when the town manager presents the budget. One of the things that he comments on is the valuation. We could say we're gonna just plan $90 million of growth a year for the next couple of years. It's probably gonna be conservative. And the town manager, through his introductory memo, can say, this is about right for this year because the assessor says this and
Mhm.
that, we have these projects going on, or it's not right for this year. And you kind of start the process that way.
Mhm.
Another way to get at a number versus each year it being recreated, what would be a good number is you have a policy like last year's number times 0.75 is our midpoint, and we know that's probably low. And then the remaining 25% of what it will be if it's equal to last year, we have a plan for, and we had discussed that a little bit earlier. If you want to, when we're at that point, if you want to speak to that, it could be as simple as that.
Driving in today, I'm like, how can we just base this on last year? So this
Yeah.
completely objective.
Last year
I think
times
we should.
0.75 or last year times 0.8. You don't want it too close to 100% because then, it's not going to be the same every year. You want to be below if you're wrong.
Yeah, I think that just the challenge of putting any member of staff, it's almost like it makes me recall if you ever seen a Fed chair testify at Congress, and you have to try to extrapolate what so many qualifiers with everything. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to truly kind of articulate all of the moving pieces. And so I think that's inherently the challenge of putting any staff member really on the spot to say, well, we're really going to base our financial planning and our budgeting on this, in this case, additional value. And so I think that's part of the sensitivity to, because if you haven't someone go out on a limb and say, I think it's going to be $100 million and it only comes at 50. Well, that's really problematic for this tax-free objective that the council has. And so I do think that if one of the suggestions is a far simpler process, I think from year to year, perhaps looking at a conservative approach to the budget. And again, that does dovetail into the next discussion about how you want to adequately plan for some other, not just tax relief, but also some other goals. I think there's some other problematic pieces to where we started the conversation. And I'm interested to see how the conversation thought process has evolved since then. Because again, valuation, additional value, and the impact on tax rate isn't the same as, for instance, as additional general purpose. That's a right, right?
Right.
So this is something that's different. It's a part of the fundamental equation. And so I think that there are ways to accomplish what I think I heard as an objective, which is to not have it all go to tax rate, but start planning for reserve account or fund balance. I think that probably would require a budget amendment, again, after sort of the valuations known before tax rate is committed, or simply planning for that reserve account as an expense in the budget at the onset. So, we want $300,000 for it, so we're representing it as an expense. And we really realistically think that, I think when we were doing back in the napkin math, 25 million in valuation, something based on current tax rates, like $400,000, So if we say, well, we're going to count on 75 million additional value, and sort of the equivalent, if you will, of 25 million, $400,000 reserve, you can always modify that in the late stages of the budget or through another budget amendment to bring the tax rate in line with where you want to be taking into consideration.
So agreed with all that. But I guess from a counselor perspective, if we look at the other side of this, we've cut investments out based off this let's say high importance of the tax rate, that the conversation was essentially, by the nature of the beast, framed the wrong way, right? So we've finished the budget process. This year, I'm trying to come up with an example that we might.
So it was like we're projecting like what 1.7%.
Yeah, right, but I mean, I've been on the council where we cut out, let's say we cut out that $40,000 project, we cut out this $80,000 project because we really wanted to get to 1.5. Well, guess what? We were actually at 1.5 or better.
Yeah.
So I think the other side of this equation, I don't want to lose sight of, is I think we're leaving investments on the table because everything's framed around the tax rate, right? So, for instance, we're coming at 1.08 this year, right? So if we knew with our magic wand, our crystal ball, well, if we were more comfortable with 1.5, to your point, that would have been perhaps a $200,000 investment. I got lost in my math, but that could have been a $200,000 investment we didn't make, right? And not so much this year, because I think this year went pretty smoothly, but I know my first year on council, we made some obviously the year after with COVID, we made some pretty significant cuts that retroactively, we probably could have saved a few of those if we could have had a crystal ball. So I don't want to lose sight of that side, because in my mind, I feel like we're somehow being too conservative.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think that's a good point. And that's kind of where my head's going too. It's like, if we take a conservative approach to this, then we're always going to be by nature lowballing our budget when we could have maybe supported other investments that we would have had we known. So I wonder if it's like, I'm supportive of like a very simple approach, like you said, John, of just trying to say 8.8 or whatever is the right place just for budgeting purposes. But maybe as part of our budget process, that's where we need, like, do we have the flexibility to say, we want to fund these items, asterisk, depending on
Yeah, right.
what the final evaluation is, and then we need to revisit that and say, it came in lower, therefore we can't fund these things anymore, and we're going to pull them from the budget. Like, I just wondered, do we have that flexibility to?
I think they essentially did that this year with the school on the school side, something similar.
We did for general purposes,
Yeah.
but I guess what Nick seemed to be suggesting, it's not all that conservative. I think it's a happy medium. Whereas if you take this year's growth, and that's the input to next year's planning process, is whatever, 135 million is your midpoint, 75% of that is the low, and 125% is the high.
Oh, you're saying previous year's growth would be the midpoint
You're going to use the actual growth from the previous year to start the conversation.
as the midpoint.
And the only difference was I was
I think I missed that
suggesting the 0.8 as the midpoint.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I was.
Okay,
So as to be conservative, but
you
That's right.
because this year it was 118.
Yeah.
That's what we thought.
No, that's what it is. I said 90,
So
and the
this year,
actual was 118.
I thought it was 130.
no,
Okay, sorry.
we came in this year with 80 as the conservative, 90 as the midpoint, 100 as the optimistic.
And we ended up at
Actually came in
118.
at
Okay. So do we account for the Downs project, or is that giving them too much credit? I mean, are we projecting in the next, or are we getting down the rabbit hole if we said, well, clearly in 3 to 4 years, we're probably going to have the next, unless I'm missing something, I feel like we're in a robust part of growth.
I think we're gonna easily hit 90 million. next
Right.
year.
Yes.
So
The
do
only
we-
difference is we may not continue to exceed, but I think we'll be roughly in the 100 range on either end for
Right.
3 years.
I mean, so do we consider making a 3-year policy, I guess, was one of the things I was gonna throw out and sunset it.
Yeah, or 80% of the prior year, 90% of the prior year, if you want to be a little less conservative,
Yeah.
that's not a bad way to.
Okay, yeah. My instinct is just 80 seems, I feel like 80,
low.
no knock on Nick's idea. I just feel like that's gonna put us right back in the
So
position.
what
where-
that'll do though, if you go to 90%, right, so the taxpayers are gonna benefit this year because the valuation came in better than expected.
Yeah.
You might have some years where they may actually, the tax rate may be go up more than.
Sure,
10%.
yeah. Yeah, I just
Right,
haven't
this-
lived through it, so I don't like, right, as soon as I live through it, I'll feel it more.
Yeah, again, we're on this upward trajectory of additional value due to all the development, but that, if that plateaus, again, this is still a great policy, if it starts to decline. And so I think that that's maybe something I would give some consideration to in terms of a policy. What are gonna be the bellwethers or indicators of having to maybe be more cautious? Because that's obviously, that's not the worst case, but when we start banking on 90 million in additional value every single year, it comes in at 65 million. Well, that's gonna have a pretty significant impact on what your tax rate projected for that. And so is there a trigger or some sort of mechanism that allows the council to not just following their own policy, put themselves in a situation where
So I see a second layer. So you have something that's really simple, like last year times 85%. But then you also have the town manager has to present the budget, right? And part of that, you could, as a policy, have him comment on whether the, assessed value in the budget package is reasonable. or not. For whatever reason, they could change, there's a lot of moving parts there. But some of it's due to real growth, some of it's due to statutory changes, like when they
Yeah.
changed the homestead exemption.
Or if the Betty exemption allows for even more equipment and then it's no longer taxable and you will only get half of that back, so. Anyway.
And so I think it's a great starting point, though, simplistic, because again, from year to year, generally, you're not going to see those big swings in growth and development, right? I mean, again, those would be things that we probably see, whereas maybe using a 10-year average, I think even looking at a 5-year average, I'm sure you'd see a pretty steep peak, and if that was a trend that we were going to even project to continue, would probably put us in a bad spot at some point. But starting with a simple formula, and then having the opportunity for those caveats about, again, increased homestead exemption, impact on personal property, other indicators we're seeing, which may give us some pause to continue that trend or adopt that policy as is.
Another thing about the revaluation years, if we are hoping to do it more frequently, every time you do it, not only is there potentially a big spike in that year, you're no longer comparing apples to apples because the cost schedules in my system are different. So it wouldn't work for those very reasons. And to go back to another point of the multi-layers of this and the opportunities, Councilor Anderson talked about the asterisk types of opportunities in the budget line items. Well, that kind of gets at what Liam was saying earlier about, maybe you create expenditures that you put in the budget, so you're accounting for it. But if the valuation comes below anticipated, you can cut some of those and you put in your addendum to a budget 2 weeks before I commit, because I tell you, we're running a little short. You may consider cutting 1 or 2 of those. I don't know how the logistics of that work. Better to have too much and cut than to try to put things in last minute after it's been approved.
So as long as we're not touching the school side, because that will have already been voted on.
Right.
There's nothing preventing us from having a meeting.
That's true, and doing whatever we want before,
commitment
right,
to-
yeah.
Yet again, I'm amenable to it, but some assessors would be very cautious about that, so it's just, not making it just something I'm comfortable doing, but, something that future counselors and future assessors, it's not tying them to anything.
I think the other solution though, rather than the asterisk approach, could be more what we've discussed of when it is a good year, if we were to set money aside, then that does become a stabilization fund for when it is a bad year and it's lower, so that we can continue to fund or pull from that fund to balance whether it was, a good year or a bad year.
Which is a good segue to the second part of the policy we're talking
Yeah.
about, right? Because I think that's,
But I do think that, again, unlike the general purpose aid fund, which was a revenue, I don't think that we can treat additional value over and above our projection in the same way. And so
Yeah.
I think that you need to, I think you need to represent that as an expense. And the methodology and the communication out to the public is, we're projecting 75 million additional value. Realistically, it could be as much as 100. We're sort of taking that equivalent expense and we're setting that aside for whatever the financial objectives are.
And I think that's a fair point, because it's either you or Council Cucci said, what do we do with the extra money? Well, there isn't extra money, right? So we have to be cautious that there isn't extra money to spend, so to speak, right? It's really a way it's translating to the tax rate, so.
And there's two aspects of the formula. There's the tax levy, the amount to be raised, and the valuation. The council's purview is how much you spend, the net budget.
Right.
So I mean, focusing as much as your policy on that as
Right.
possible is wise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think through the general purpose aid, because what gets passed to the assessor is the net budget, that's net of revenue. So we did essentially change the net budget because based on the change in the estimate for general purpose aid. So I think we might need to take this through a little deeper, but.
So it'd be better policy
I see
not
them
to-
as pretty similar.
Yeah.
Where if we had it in the budget order, conditional statement like we did this year that says, to the extent that our estimate was high or low, this is what we'd like to happen. I think the two would be pretty similar.
But the amount that we are going to spend is one variable in the council's purview. The value is determined by the assessor, and those two numbers together create the tax rate, right? So I think that if I followed the initial comments correctly, if the value came in at 50 million over, the question is, what do we do with that additional value? And I think that I don't see how because you can't decrease the valuation by saying, well, let's set that the revenue associated with that additional value that we didn't anticipate aside. So I think you have to have an expense to match that additional value. That's how I thought.
So could we then, to your point, like as part of the budget process, could we be planning our expenses based on what we project the value to be, but again, reserve the right, if for some reason it comes in lower or higher, maybe higher is where it's harder, right? But if it came in lower, we could actually say, well, our goal was to put X in a reserve account. Now that, it came in lower, the first thing we would pull is we're not going to that goal for the reserve account increase. We're going to pull that back to account for the decline. I guess the challenge is what happens when it's a good year? What can we do? Because we don't know it's a good year until we know it's a good year. But it sounds like maybe we can't do anything
Well,
like that, or
Paul's idea of not having the estimate be so conservative would mean it wouldn't be that much of a swing if we were off in the positive direction.
Uh-oh. I think I've decided I don't know if I even support a policy like that whatsoever. Because I think our job is to set how much money we spend. And I think it's our problem that we're so focused on the mill rate. Because that's what actually is happening here. The council's job is to allocate how much money we're gonna spend, period, and where we're gonna spend it. And I don't think we should have a policy, to Liam's point. I think we all understand the difference between, spending the money and the value, the numerator and the denominator of the equation. I think that we have this case of being result oriented, right? Oh, shoot, we could have maybe done a little bit more. We could have put some in the reserve account. Well, I think that's on us. I don't know if I even support a policy that retroactively afterwards. To me, if we get the number too small and the valuation comes in big, then good for the taxpayer. I know I'm completely flipping here, but the more I'm working this out, I feel like so much of this is actually when I say I see the council that from 10 years ago to now, it's our fault, so to speak, because of the way that we frame our decision-making. Because we frame our decision-making on the mill rate. If we framed our decision-making more on whether we think something's a good investment or not.
that's a good point.
So I apologize for blowing up the conversation, but
I've been fighting the mill rate discussion for.
yeah, well,
years,
I think you and I both.
That's not to say there's no value in it. And
Sure, yes.
The value is, what do you want to hold? Where do you want to be stable, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is we're growing. And if you don't grow in theory, if you don't grow your capacity to handle that growth, then you're digging a hole,
Yeah.
right? So that's where, incorporating the valuation into the equation does make some sense, but it also introduces some uncertainty because you don't know exactly what that is when you're trying to determine the spending.
Do you ever pay attention to the change in annual budget? I mean,
Yeah.
because people are so fixated on the tax rate increase or decrease,
Oh,
the change in annual budget from year to year, it's been, last year it was 3.6, the year before it was 1.75, the year before it was 4.3. Is that part of the discussion? And you're suggesting maybe that should be more of the focus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just, let's back it up. So every year we have what's called the goal setting workshop for the budget. And we kind of debate how we're going to frame the conversation.
Mhm.
I think that when you frame the conversation in respect to the mill rate, far and away, it's the easiest to communicate to the residents. And I think that that's always trumped. I have serious issues with it too. I think I just illustrated one of them. But what we always end up coming back to, I think I voted against it my first year. I don't know if Clucci voted against it, but there's always one or two of us that say, no, I don't like this.
Mhm.
But we ultimately end up going with it because the communication piece trumps the day, because there's been all sorts of discussion with that.
Mhm.
But going back to maybe hybriding what Liam was saying, perhaps we have that reserve account. Perhaps that reserve account gets funded for X amount of dollars. And maybe that gets funded for X amount of dollars every year.
Yeah.
And that reserve account, maybe that reserve account gets that funding of the reserve accounts gets decreased if we overestimate the value. That could be a way to, I don't know, just trying
I think you just made me switch too.
to.
I think to your point, the problem is like we need to be much more holistic in how we set goals for the budget with the mill rate. If we all agree we want to grow a reserve account because that's important, we need to bite the bullet and say we're going to fund it at X and it's going to contribute X% towards the mill rate growth, and we're just going to say that's like going to happen or be committed to that, I guess, as opposed to trying to solve it this way, because I think we're trying to solve it. We're trying to solve the mill rate problem through the valuation, which isn't the right solution to your point.
So to play into
Yeah.
reeling the whole conversation, I want to talk about how I'm used to doing this.
Yeah.
And that is when you're trying to project your budget for next year, there's kind of two components of growth. One is going to be inflation, right? So it costs you more to pay next year in theory, hopefully for you, than it does this year. Right, and that's something that is generally pretty stable, 1 to 2%, and that's something that Liam could probably give us a figure for. And then there's additional spending that's needed to support the growth that's happening, the real growth that's happening in town. And I don't know what our average is, maybe around 1%, half to 1%. It's been higher than that. It's been more like 1 to 2%. I think for the past couple of years. But the addition of those two, so if you have 2% inflation and 2% real growth, then your growth budget should go up 4%. Right? And that's the way I'm used to thinking about budget.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
But that's not how we've done it yet. And so I don't know if changing the conversation to, well, inflation is going to be 2%, real growth is going to be 1%, budget's going to go up 3%. I don't know if that's attainable. It's trying to shift the mindset here because we've been doing it this way for so long. And we've been talking about it in terms of mill rate.
Is it possible to do both this next year, but trying to make that the focus, but telling people the other number as well so they can follow along? I mean,
you gotta start somewhere. That's the point. We want to change the conversation. I just don't know when. But maybe just to circle back on this specific policy, just to kind of nail this piece down. I think we're all generally supportive of picking a percentage based on last year and using that to frame the estimate that would come forward at the budget. I like though having language or something that gives the town manager some latitude based on certain outside factors, economics, the state, that he during his budget presentation would say, I think this is too conservative, I think it's too high given these factors, and we want to give an adjusted recommendation. I feel like that would be maybe a more accurate policy for what we would want. What do you guys think about that?
I would say, yeah, because since we're circling back to what's on paper, if we
Yeah.
were to edit what's on paper, I agree with that. I think something similar to what Nick said, I still think we're in danger of being a little too conservative, so I would probably like to debate that. you know, about what that number is, so to
It's right
speak.
above the 90%. Yeah, whether it's 80% or 90%.
Yeah, that, right, to me, I'm on board exactly. I would probably want to debate what the number is, but yeah, yep.
I also, because we've always been, I think, just as a practice, and whether it's valuation or it's anticipated revenues, I think we've always been conservative, which has put this real pressure on expenses and spending right out of the gate, right? I mean, if we underestimate everything right out of the gate, accounting for those inflationary measures is there's friction right away. I guess going back to the thought about what about including financial objectives in the budget, right? And maybe starting with, what if you started with, we're going to adopt the valuation growth that we had last year as a starting point. We don't know what it's going to be. It could be higher than that, could be lower than that, but we're going to build into the budget all of these other, we want a tax stabilization fund, we want a capital reserve account. And then after the value is known, once that variable is known, you reserve the right to tweak the expenses through a budget amendment to bring down some of those pieces to meet your 3% target or whatever your target is. To say, this is what we're going to commit. We're going to commit to not going in over 3%. If it, again, absent adjusting some of these financial objectives that are really nice to have, but they're not necessary for operations. You don't need to commit to a tax stabilization fund at the expense of the tax rate this year, right? That would be probably not a popular policy to say, well, we're going to have a 3.7% tax increase because we want to commit to holding the tax rate below 3% in future years. That's probably loser. But that might be a way to take some of that pressure right out of the gate to say, this is what we're going to adopt for whether it's a revenue or whether it's a anticipated valuation, a new evaluation, new value. And we're going to see what that does to the overall budget. And then we're going to amend it after the fact, once we know that, to keep it consistent with our goal and objective. It's just a fact. I like it.
Actually, that's what I like that. I'd rather account for it and reduce it if we over accounted for it. Yeah. I guess first of all, I think that's the best idea so far. But I guess I don't want to, to Liam's point, if we fund it and the tax rate comes, let's say it's all done and we fund it and now the tax rate's 3.2%. So then we would take that quote 2% extra and reduce those accounts that you just said. Those would automatically be reduced by the 2%. I'm talking in terms of the 0.2%, talking in terms of the.
But I don't think it'd be automatic. I think we'd actually have a meeting.
Well, okay,
Around time.
good. So then my concern would be, are we setting ourselves up to debate the tax rate all over again? That would be my only concern from a process standpoint. Are we setting ourselves up to have two debates and almost going through the budget process 1.5 times? That's my only concern. I love it, but I don't know if we play it out like if we work really hard to get consensus at a good conservative yet well-funded budget.
And then you open the door.
And then, do we open the door to blow it up? And that's my concern with that.
Well, what's the policy that carry the day? Would be the commitment to holding, again, just using the goal that we've had, the council's had 3%, or is it the goal of committing to future tax stabilization or reserve accounts to get off of the reliance on bond? And I think that's a great policy discussion to have at the time.
Yeah.
And you could put a constraint around it where you only open it up for budget amendment if it's, if the tax rate's over 3.5% or something, somewhere around that.
I just wouldn't also want to take away the possibility of it having, it's good to have the tax rate to be 1.5% some year. So I don't want to go the other way. I don't want to fund this thing, there's times where it's appropriate not to have even 2%, so that's my only, right? So there might be times where that's a zero, that account is zero.
Those accounts would be, you would plan.
Zero.
for it to be zero.
Yeah. Getting back to the paper, I think we're in a good place.
Yeah.
I think we just need to debate. Like I'm of the mind that I think, Nick, how many years do you have?
What do you mean?
How many years do you have from in front of you?
Of previous years?
Yeah.
This is on the thing that's on the assessing website. That helps.
But there's a lot of
Yeah.
contributing factors. for
No,
the
sure, totally.
process.
That's just some of the numbers there. It doesn't show the number increase, it shows the percent increases, but an example, we were talking about last year, 118.5 million was the increase. 80% of that is 95 million. 75% is 89 million. Yeah. You could run those numbers.
Yeah,
I think I'm skewed because of what I've lived for the last 3 years. And so it's hard for me my reality right now is that it's always too conservative. And it's always too conservative. And then it ends up being better than it should be, which is great, but it's almost like, I mean, we saw this. I mean, I would have loved to have 1.5% on the front page of the Leader at the beginning of budget season versus it getting buried at 1.08 at the end.
I'm gonna sound like Ken, but we've been going through unprecedented growth the past couple of years.
Yeah.
130 is not something, I think that's probably the most ever.
Yeah.
You're not doing a reval in place.
Yeah.
Right. No, I agree. That's why I feel like it shouldn't be
And I'm
so
pretty sure it's
conservative.
gonna be 90, probably over 100 next year again, right?
Well, so me too. That's my point. So I guess I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is 90%. Right.
Yeah.
So
So then they'd be coming in with growth of what, 100 million, is that?
It's up to you guys. you
yeah,
know,
but based
uh,
off this year, it'd be 118 times 9%, right? So
And then with the caveat language, though, however you decide upon it, of leeway, if there's circumstances that the town manager is aware of, for his suggestion. Because the first budget is the town's shot at it, right?
sure. Yeah.
So,
I think that I don't want to write a policy that dictates how the town manager does his job, but I think I would like to say some parameters around that, right? I mean, I want to make sure that, and I just,
Well, I think that's what our policy is.
Yeah,
It's it, how he has to do his job.
Yeah.
The policy is the starting point is, 90% of the prior year growth. Right? And then the other requirement is commentary on is that sufficient or insufficient? When he presents the budget.
Yeah.
I think that's probably not.
Yeah, I don't know how specific. need
what
to
if you
get.
just gave the town manager the option to choose 75, 90, or 100%?
Oh, okay, so you can put it in his, well, I don't know if he'd like that, but maybe.
Or 80, 100, or 110%?
I
Like,
prefer to go with 90.
Yeah.
And let him
massage it.
or her exercise their discretion later, if
Is that going to end us up in a different place? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I think we would have to then take the judgment based on what he provides to determine whether or not we want to go with a more conservative or optimistic approach, depending on what he provides. Or say, no, we want to stick to this number.
He's gonna come in at 75% every time.
Yeah.
And so, right, so this is not a commentary on our town manager, but it's almost like during this process, you're almost incentivized to be conservative.
Right, not actually.
So I'm trying to guard against that a little bit,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So that's my concern, would be that if we did, John, you nailed it, why wouldn't you come in at 75%?
Yeah.
Right, because you don't want to, one of Tom's favorite things is he wants to under promise and over deliver. Well, guess what 75% does?
Yeah.
It certainly under promises and over delivers.
Mhm.
And that's okay, because at the end of the day, he's not dealing with the politics of it, right? He's just dealing with what the end result is.
But I guess I would think, and this is obviously a discussion at the council level, but I would think we really want to pair being more aggressive in your estimations to, again, some of these other long-term financial plan pieces. I think that
Yeah.
gives you, again, it's not fat to cut, but it's more pain-free decisions to make in the event we need to meet our other
Yeah.
objectives. And so I think what I would certainly want to be cognizant to if I was at the council level is, you're not gonna budget the way you always budgeted and spend within that if you're not committing to other long-term financial objectives.
We could stipulate in the policy that 15% of that growth is gonna go to a reserve account. So that's kind of to Lynn's point. So let's say I'm gonna go with 90 million. Let's say you're gonna come in at 90 million. You're gonna comment on whether that's too high or too low. Well, 15 million of that growth should be earmarked towards a reserve account.
Would you call that 50 million to 90 million or
50
above
to
and
90.
beyond in case we overestimate?
Well, you can go either way.
To me, we'd do it above and beyond,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
if we took, just for math, because we're throwing verbally a lot of numbers around. Let's say if we did at 100 million, let's say the target's 100 million. Then the reserve account would get budgeted at the level of 110 million.
Yeah, 10%.
And then that way, if it comes in at 110, we're done. If it comes in lower than expected, we would, to Liam's point, we've already funded the reserve account. right?
But through a budget amendment,
We could reduce it.
you could reduce it to come in line.
Right.
with the-
But now I think we're kind of circling the drain a little bit now, I think.
So now you get 90% and then 10% of that growth goes to reserve.
10% additional, I would say.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're funding it with an overestimation.
So we're planning for the overestimation.
We're underestimating, it's coming in over. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that would go to Tony's point, the more strategic.
Yeah. And to Liam's point, though, we fund it. We don't just say it's gonna
Yeah.
do it. It gets funded that way
Yeah,
during our process.
and then if we have to pull back later because of,
Once that variable is known, once that value is known, determine whether that's a mill rate that the council's control or not. And perhaps, again, we all know what the pie in the sky, what the objective is every year. Maybe that changes, maybe it doesn't. Maybe to Paul's point, that's all great, but we really feel like we need something other than 3. This puts us in over that.
So then you're only having that meeting to reduce spending,
You're only having that meeting to reduce the spend.
which would be less, I think, less concentration.
And I guess, let's just talk about how would that affect the communication challenge? So we're saying the valuation of the town's 100 million. That's the estimation.
The growth.
Or we're actually working off 110. Because we're gonna use that reserve account. That reserve account's gonna be part of the numerator of the 100 million. So we just have to be cautious because that's gonna
So the
inflate.
midpoint is your 100 million.
Yeah,
Uh,
Yeah.
But on the expense side,
Okay.
you've got to have
Yeah.
10% of whatever that is going to go to it.
but I guess I'm saying it's gonna inflate the projected value, which isn't the end of the world.
It will.
Yeah.
Not to change gears too much, because it seems like you're on a good trajectory, but just the logistics of the final weeks before commitment could get pretty fishy, because I don't know the exact number until the day before I commit sometimes. I'll know
Yeah, sure.
a week or two before that, I'll have a much better estimate. A month before, I'll have a much better estimate, but some figures are still coming in and being readjusted. For example, in June into July, I'm sending out letters to people and it's only going down from that point
Yeah.
because they're bringing things to my attention. So I won't know the exact number until right before commitment. So when is this meeting happening?
do you think you'll know like, hey, you guys are gonna be way off or way below? The accuracy might not be, like, if we're off by a certain percentage, it's probably not a big deal, but like for this year, how high it was, like, you probably knew that at your 2-week prior mark, that it was gonna come in significantly higher, so I think,
Within reason, yes.
yeah. like
So it's just
knowing-
knowing when that's gonna occur is a little tricky, but
I guess why don't we take Nick out of we could just take Nick completely out of this conversation and go more conservative on our estimated valuation.
Mhm.
With a fiscal policy that also requires X amount of money, because we're conservative on our valuation, it could require X amount of money to be put in a reserve account. And we don't mention Nick, all that's done.
Mhm.
And if something hits the fan, then maybe we just go, if there's an emergency here, then we deal with it. But do we have to?
But there's going to be a year where we're not conservative. If we're
Yeah.
always taking the prior year times
Yeah.
correct.
90%. At some
Fair
point,
enough.
our growth is gonna start, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
And the less you involve me is probably the better.
Like, I guess, are we trying to find a solution to something that's not a problem? Like, now all of a sudden we turning into creating a fiscal policy that automatically funds a reserve account. Because that's kind of what this conversation is
Yeah.
pivoted to, which that's okay.
We're talking about reserve account, but I feel like we need more time though to think about like what are the other financial goals that we want to pursue, because I remember Tom mentioning when we had the conversation before that maybe our fund balance needs to go up. And maybe our fund balance first, and then maybe a reserve account, and then maybe a tax rate. Like there's probably like a hierarchy of things in our fiscal policy that we want to make sure we cover first and say that's the path we want to take for that extra percentage that we would want to plan for. And again, it's like, as if the plan comes back lower, then we pull back on those different triggers, or maybe the fund balance isn't going to be as high that year, and we're not going to have a reserve account, or we're not going to set aside money in a tax stabilization fund, but we can always plan for it. Like, we could always plan that we're going to have it in a good year, but then to your point, if we have to pull back, it's going to pull back on those things that ideally we would do if we had a good year, but if we don't, then we have that flexibility to pull back.
it probably gives you that buffer too, to sort of, by planning for that out of gate in the budget process, to pull back and really have quite a lot more control over that mill rate without painful cuts to essential services, which is where we always have a conversation.
Yeah.
We're always talking about staffing or equipment or whatever. Right? So again, but I do think the trick is, not to belabor it, but the trick is to not be so conservative in our estimations right out of the gate. I understand that's playing with fire, because especially when you're talking about revenue projections, if you come in $500,000 shy, well, that's really impactful. But I think I think it does though, by giving yourself greater bandwidth out of the gate, it allows you to start putting some of those things in and planning for those things. So we really don't ever afford ourselves because we are so conservative.
Right.
Our policy may be sufficient in that area. So we only calculate unassigned fund balance, which is we want 10.5% of the prior year's budget. But we don't know what our unassigned fund balance is until it's calculated, which is when we produce the annual statement. So assuming we get that work done before Tom presents us the budget, then we'll know what that number is and if there's a hole to it. I think the policy already says you should, if it's not the 10.5%, but if it's below 8 or something, whatever the threshold is, then you have to actually fund it somehow or take actions to improve it. So I think the policy, our fiscal policy probably covers that sufficiently right now. The question is, when we create a reserve account, that's restricted fund balance. So that's a different calculation.
Yeah.
Do we want this, whatever delta, to go to a restricted account or to just flow into fund balance? That's a loose question. I don't know how you can budget to improve your fund balance.
And our fund balance fiscal policy is pretty aggressive, right? Compared to other towns, as far as percentage of our operating budget is concerned.
I was under the impression it was lower.
I think it's lower
Our
compared to,
actual reserves are lower than a lot of comparable counties.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's probably on the low end, or the rating agencies,
said it was on the low end.
but it's acceptable. It's totally fine, but some like to see 2 months worth of expenses. We tend to target about.
But our fiscal policy, if that's a 3, right? Of that in our fiscal policy, you want 3 months of.
Of unassigned, it's 10, well, it's a minimum of 8.5, and the target's 10.5%.
And what percentage are we at right now? We're over 80, right?
I don't know.
Okay.
So this is where we haven't calculated it yet for this year.
I think we're usually between 8.5 and 9.
Yeah, okay, that's
I do
right. 'Cause
remember at the finance meeting though, Ruth and Christie saying that where the bond rating agencies do say that's an area of improvement, that the fund balance is at the place where it's acceptable. But if it went any lower, it wouldn't be. So to pad that over time would be wise financially for bond ratings. I don't know how that's done. But
In terms of timing, again, we should receive our statement in December, January of each year, which should theoretically predate the budget by a month or so. So that should, if everything works as it should be possible.
just to make steps towards, I'd like to make a motion to recommend to the entire council that we repeal the current policy that we've been talking about. Maybe we don't do anything else right now, but I just want to make that motion to do that. And then we do that, we can rewrite it now, or we can do it next meeting. But I think we agree that we're going to, I feel like we agree that we're going to repeal the one that was shared on the screen. So I'm going to make a motion that we recommend to the entire council that we repeal that policy. Yeah.
Discussion.
I've had enough discussion. on it.
I'm firmly behind that. I don't think this policy is it's not being used. I fully support repeal. I would like to do a repeal replace though.
Me too. I'm trying to make baby steps towards just pulling us back and. so.
So so on the, okay, so I guess you made that motion.
Yeah.
You should probably vote on that.
Okay, all those in favor, raise your hand.
All right, so that's gone.
I feel like we need to continue the conversation. Because I think we all agree we need to set a target. I think we're debating, do we want to be conservative or do we want to be, more optimistic? And if we're going to be optimistic, how much do we want to also do that in addition to? And where do we want to apply that in addition to? And I feel like we need a little bit more discussion on that piece, and I don't know if we have all the information we need right now, or if we need to wait for the next finance meeting with Ruth to kind of
Yeah, we need something to look at.
Yeah,
And I don't know who drafts our policies. Is this something that we do or does staff usually help with?
I think staff usually provides some support.
You think that we've
Tom-
given enough to kind of put a shell together?
Yeah, I think that we've had enough discussion to put something on paper for us for you to digest and work through and respond to. Sure. I mean, I think that conceptually it's the, you know, I think that we're clear with the 90% idea of prior year evaluation with sort of an opportunity for some qualifiers or revisions by the town manager, and then some equivalent based on the prior year's valuation, sort of the equivalent revenue anticipated to be generated to go into, you know, some sort of, again, whether that's unassigned fund balance or some sort of reserve or tax stabilization account. So I think conceptually we have a framework down that we can put out there for a response.
I don't think I'm 100% comfortable directing staff yet. I feel like this is probably one of the most fruitful committee conversations I think I've had in my experience. I think I think our thinking might change, and we're in a really good timing wise. I think we're in a really good spot. There's no rush. So I don't think I need staff to devote time. I feel like we're all on the finance committee as well. I feel like the more we get into this, I think we're close.
So we want to take.
Yeah,
one step at a time?
I would like to marinate it. Because I don't want to get, I think there's been a lot of good ideas coming, and I don't know which one's the right idea yet. And I think we're all in this mindset that we're all pretty open-minded here, so, right now.
So how about,
Yeah.
as a starting point, using, we can fight over discussing on
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
but 90% of the prior year's valuation growth will be used as the midpoint.
Yeah.
For the current year. We all on,
yeah.
Yes, that's like the one thing I'm on board with. Yeah,
and you're good with 90%?
yes, yeah.
So 98%. So I'm putting something.
Yeah.
So what's the next step? So what else do you care about?
And I'm okay with the playing around with the town manager's discretion.
Okay, so the town manager will comment on,
But besides that, I don't want to go any further messing around with, you know, what's going where or any of these funky mechanisms, because so that's where I am. I have no problems directing staff to do that, John. I think what Liam had heard from us, I think is way too much right now. I'm okay with those two little.
so we got
babies.
1, 2,
Yeah.
and yeah, and then that's what I was trying to go.
Yeah.
So the next step is, do you want to force them to budget for a reserve account or not?
And my answer right now is not.
I'm fine with these two,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah.
The more you try to tie somebody's hands, you know, there's something you didn't think about, that it might not make sense to budget for some of these accounts in a given year.
I wonder, just to build on to that, I feel like giving the council some flexibility each year from a goal setting perspective as part of budget might be a better way in having that conversation, just to make sure, you know.
So
Again,
that was my introductory offer.
Mhm.
But the thing is, we don't have to set goals as a council, right? There's nothing
Yeah.
tying councils to doing anything. And Tom's response was, I have to present the budget. So if
Yeah.
if you actually want it to be done, tasking the town manager with it is probably a better way. I think I see this rationale.
Mhm.
I think we will have a budget, that we will set budget goals again next year.
I mean, I'd rather make a policy that said the first reading budget shall include a $100,000 allocation to a tax stability fund.
Mhm.
And that way, at least you're forcing that conversation. And specifically say first reading, so you're not committing that it has to happen at the end. I would be comfortable doing that, then it just forces us to have that conversation. It forces Tom to take, you know, whether he's conservative or liberal or anywhere in between, that's $100,000 that is dedicated to an account. And then it just then every year we can just have the discussion. So I think that might be a more eloquent way to get to the same endpoint, but
So.
just
maybe-
brainstorming. I
maybe-
know, yeah.
Again, maybe like in terms of this policy.
Yeah, that's right, which is
I'm
probably not the
comfortable,
spot.
I'm comfortable with what you said of
1, 2.
90% and giving the town manager some discretion. So I think maybe we can have town staff just draft something like that. That's pretty simple and straightforward. And maybe up to you, John, but maybe at the next finance committee. I feel like we're trying to do
Agreed.
is solve what's the result,
Yeah.
what's the reserve fund strategy? And does this fit in? Does it not fit in? Is it a different approach? So maybe just having that conversation of if we wanted to be more deliberative about creating a reserve fund, what is that reserve fund and how do we want to go about it? Is it just the piece that we're always going to put it in the budget at first reading, or is it something else we're gonna do.
I think it's a separate discussion.
Yeah.
If you guys, that's where I'm kind of leaning right now. Is it probably doesn't need to fit with our midpoint valuation estimate.
Okay.
But the downside of forcing it to come in with a budget that has potentially 200 grand of fat or 100 grand of fat is the headline is going to be, the budget's at 8% or no rates, an 8% increase or something like that.
Well, how much does 100 grand move the needle?
It's not that. much.
Yeah.
100 grand is not much.
Just as a numbers guy here, last year's increase times 0.9 would be, well, 106 or 107 million, which is a lot. Other towns get like 20 or 30. You know,
but
I know we're
that's-
on a trend of big value in the
Yeah,
downs and
yeah.
beyond, but like, this is an anomaly. It might last 3 years. That's a lot. So.
I guess just hearing.
It's
this-
almost like a rolling average would be good.
I think just hearing the discussion, I think there's value to having a starting point with regard to budget purposes and trying to anticipate additional value because it is so impactful to the mill rate, which is such an overarching goal. I think the other components we talked about around, equivalent of 10% of additional value on top of that to be in these other sort of financial planning mechanisms. Those really sound to me more like, FY22 potential budget goals and recommendations out of either the finance committee or
Yeah,
rules and
yeah.
policies that maybe then do get incorporated in future years into a policy, but to see how that kind of works.
Yeah.
I think those are kind of a level of specificity that we're really is a product of the environment we're in right now with regard to growth, right? And so that's, I guess, my reaction to that. I think it can be very tangible goals, but maybe short and shy of a policy at this point.
Yeah, I agree.
I like that only because I think it requires us to think more at budget about beyond the mill rate, what are the other financial goals we have, where the mill rate does need to factor in, but is that the only indicator? Is that the primary indicator? Or are there other things we want to set goals for that year? And again, we're setting expectations early with the public, hopefully, so that we can make sure they're aware. So I would prefer, like, I just personally like the idea of leaving it up to the council to have some discretion in goal setting, to plan for a reserve account or plan for whatever is a priority. So I would also be supportive of, at least for reserve planning, being very specific and saying we should set a certain number aside as a starting point at the
Yeah,
beginning of the budget.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me when you go to a lot of the policy wonk conferences that are offered to us is, one of the lines you hear a lot is, a budget's supposed to reflect what your values are that year. And we do that backwards, right? And, it'd be brilliant. And that doesn't mean we might increase the mill rate by 2%. So that's not what I'm saying. I really wish we would work on framing. What are we valuing this year? What are we, and to me, it sounds to me like, for instance, this past year, we valued planning for the future. Wouldn't that have been nice if we made that a goal? So then we kind of did that through the entire process. Still ended up at a very low mill rate increase. So I'm not saying just because we frame things in terms of valuing stuff doesn't mean we're going to spend.
Yeah.
What it means is it frames the conversation where, we can ask the town manager, we're valuing tax stability for the future this year. Where is that? Let's create that. We're valuing we have this new facilities master plan. We're valuing that. That needs to be at the forefront. That way, when we do have to make cuts, let's not cut the things we've already agreed that we value, right? And so that's just my plug for when we do this all over again.
I nailed it.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see how, I think the backstop in terms of, again, the narrative out of the gate is always so important, but the backstop around, I think if you pair some of these objectives and maybe a more optimistic viewpoint of valuation and revenues, I think the
Yes,
backstop
yeah.
is recommitting or reaffirming there's an endpoint to that,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so that's where the council does agree to revisit the spending priorities if it crosses that threshold that the
Yeah,
council's
yeah,
not
yeah,
committed.
exactly.
I just one other comment, just because I think it's really interesting is, how does all this relate to possible changes in TIF policy and sheltering some of that value, right? So let's add that to the mix.
Yeah,
They're related, because.
Absolutely, because you're talking about
grow without
capturing,
Yeah.
sheltering
In 3 years, you're
value.
gonna lose 60%. And that's the trick. So you have money today, but you don't have it
Yeah.
tomorrow. You really need to think through that.
There's a whole nother level of complexity to the financial planning. So that's 90%. I think that's where we're at.
Yeah.
90%.
Do we have to do we vote on that, or is that good enough? We're not bringing it to the council, though, I guess.
We're really close to having a policy. I think it's gonna be like 2 censuses, maybe 3 censuses. right?
Is there any taste for a caveat like there was about when there's a reval year or whatnot? Because this won't work again, because in a reval, if there's a big market shift, it goes up double, triple, what you would expect.
So why won't this work? Let's talk about that. for a minute. So in a reval year, we're not gonna know the revaluation until you commit, right?
Or
we're
shortly
gonna-
before, yeah.
We're gonna use the prior, so it'll be in the years following a reval, we're
Okay,
not gonna wanna use the. growth
sure,
from
but during the
prior.
year of, it'd be fine,
It'd be fine the year
Yeah.
of.
Yep.
The year after, I don't know what to do there.
but you have time to figure that out,
That's
because
right.
it's not right now.
I'd be okay with putting the caveat there, 'cause it's not gonna hurt anybody.
Sure.
Yeah, in the year.
Policy shall be
reval.
revisited after a reval.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Just so we can all kind of see what,
Yeah.
3 years from now, sit around and see what it did.
Yeah, I think I'd agree you have policies that reflect or give an expectation as to what those triggers or caveats might be. I think that you put in changes to these programs or evaluation are certainly subject to additional disclosure and comment.
For budget, you probably wanna take the second prior year. So in the year following the reval.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Just leave out the year that doesn't make
just leave
sense.
out the reval.
Yeah.
We could write that in the policy.
Yeah, it could be something simple as that.
I'd get behind that if we want to give that to Liam.
That makes sense, there?
Yep.
Yep. that sounds good.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, right?
Well, why don't we,
We skip it.
why don't we draft something and bring it back to the next committee meeting for review and comment, if we make work with it?
Sounds good. All right, any other discussion on this? No? All right, any public comment? For anybody in the public?
There is not.
Okay. Can I get a motion to adjourn that? Or is there, before we do that, is there any other topics at an upcoming rules and policy meeting that you guys would want to discuss? Anything top of mind right now? I feel like a lot of this fiscal stuff will probably get discussed first in finance before we would maybe deliberate it in rules and policy, correct? Because I feel like that's the direction we're going with the test, with the other things that maybe need to be discussed. I don't know if we could do that here. Other than those, I don't think there's anything else that's top of mind.
Something to maybe consider, you can totally just shoot this down, is maybe for council agendas, committee updates possibly being after the manager report. I think that a while back, right, were you on the council meeting with the town manager report?
So
So,
it used to be at the end, right?
yeah, and so I think I think a resident should be able to tune into a council meeting, hear the update from the town manager, hear the update from councilors, and then turn the TV off if they want to. Yeah, so that,
One thing I did notice, and I don't know if we want to push this, but when I attended some of the other towns, like it wasn't an optional, like, who wants to give an update? It was finance committee. Now's your time to give your
Yeah.
update, and you gave your update, and then they
Yeah.
kind of went around the
Yeah.
room, and everybody gave like a short update of what happened in the last committee meeting. I feel like that might be,
to be fair, that's me. So Peter used to go down the line.
oh, we did?
He did, and so that's a stylistic thing for me to save time. I just had gotten the
I think he
impression.
likes the time saver.
Yep, that's,
So
well, let's put it this way, your feedback is noted, or we could make policy around it.
Yeah.
The raise your hand thing is totally a COVID, me being chair.
Yeah.
Peter used to go down the line. And my observations, which by the way, I had no problems with it, but my observations were council comments, people are saying things because they felt like they had to.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't need to say things.
Yeah.
But I know that's ironic coming from me, right? And then it's same thing with the committees, like if you don't
Yeah.
have it just, but I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly with something like finance, maybe finance should always give an update, right? Because that's the big one. I don't know.
Well, that could be part of the agenda. If you
Yeah.
wanted to, but,
And to be honest with you, if we move it to the front, people are probably gonna, counselors themselves will probably be more prone to saying more, because we're fresh, we're not tired, we don't want to just
Yeah.
adjourn the meeting.
I think that's,
So there,
Yeah.
so maybe you and I's perspective would meet halfway if we moved it.
The other thing I was kind of thinking about, same thing, the order of the agenda.
Yeah.
is Why do we have a specific agenda item for adjustments to the agenda?
Yeah, I don't know.
Can't we just, somebody can always motion,
Yeah,
or could always motion to adjust the agenda?
so we could put that on the conversation too.
Yeah,
Is that,
not a big deal,
is
but
that in the policy though? Is it in the?
it is, it's in the, so that, yeah.
So it has to require it to amend the policy so that the agenda
Yeah, the structure of the agenda
is codified.
is in the policy.
And if you really want to give our town manager heartburn, we could put counselor comments at the, right after general public comments. So we could respond, we could use counselor comments as a place to respond to general public comments.
yeah, so it sounds like.
Because that's
maybe-
one of the observations I think you made about Falmouth,
Yeah.
that you liked that they would sit there quietly and listen to the general public,
Mhm,
but then the counselors did comment.
mhm.
Now, I know.
Can we have a second public comment? then right after?
And then a second counselor.
Sometimes
Who's
we're
getting the
rigid
last
for
word?
no, like, real great reason, right? So that's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, no, look, it's one of those things that I get why you wouldn't want it. I get why you wouldn't want it, but I think that there are times that clearly nobody makes comments until they do make comments. And then when they do make comments, it is, or sometimes they ask rhetorical questions and then you have to sit there and act like you don't care about their rhetorical, or maybe the question's not rhetorical, but we treat it as it's rhetorical.
Yeah,
So again, I know it might give staff a heartburn because I'm sure that might be something that adds to the length of a meeting. But
Well, you could change it to public discussion.
something to consider.
yeah, so maybe, so next meeting, 2 topics. One would be to review the draft policy that you guys provide based on this discussion, and the second one might be just general agenda
Yeah,
recommendations to the council agenda, okay? Cool, and if you guys think of anything else in the meantime, just let me know.
Yeah.
All right, item 6, adjournment. Can I get a motion? to
Motion to
adjourn?
adjourn.
second.
Uh,
All those in favor?
all those supporting? Thanks for coming, Nick.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah, are you
I
comfortable
don't know
with-
if we invited you. I'm glad we did.
John,
Okay.
yeah,
Thank you, John.
I wanted to make sure it made sense, but I feel comfortable. Yeah, I just,